Good evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome to this evening's webinar on school finances and the role of the Treasurer. Before I hand you over to your host for this evening, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're in Zoom webinar format, so you'll notice that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to use this Q&A button and ask questions throughout, and what your presenters will do is collate the most commonly asked questions for a frequently asked questions document that will be sent out after the event. There is also a feedback survey that you can click on and fill out as soon as the webinar ends, and we would encourage you to do this as well, please. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to your host for this evening, Noreen Lawler from the CPSMA. Noreen.
Thank you for that, Leo. Good evening, everyone, and you're all very welcome to tonight's webinar. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Paul O'Donnell, I would like to welcome you to the board finances and the role of the Treasurer, one that was requested by you, our members, and we're delighted to be able to present it to you tonight. We're also joined tonight by Joe Conlon from the Financial Support Services Unit, the FSSU. Joe is going to join us on the panel. So just to give you a bit of background to the training, when face-to-face training was suspended back in March, we had just begun the rollout of our training for treasurers. I think we'd gone through maybe 3 or 4 face-to-face sessions. So since then, we've had a lot of requests for the training. So we've tailored the face-to-face module, and we hope that it suits this online delivery. Obviously, you're not going to have the same level of detail, but what we did was we based the content on the questions that you sent in at registration, because it's important that it's relevant to you and it's relevant to the particular stage of the Board of Management term, because we have to acknowledge that, you know, boards of management are a year into their 4-year term. So we've got treasurers in situ who've been in place for a year and who have built up, you know, a lot of experience throughout that year. And we hope that what you hear tonight will affirm the good practices that you've established. We're mindful that a lot of board members as well may be in this position of treasurer for more than 1 term and have a lot of experience or have vast experience in the area of finance. But we also have treasurers who haven't got this prior experience. So we're hopefully going to pitch the content so that it will support everyone, whether you've got a lot of experience or whether you're new to the role. Because certainly based on the registration, we know that there are a number of treasurers who are just in place since September 2020. So hopefully you'll all find it beneficial. So as I say, the content has been determined by the questions that you submitted. As Leo said, please feel free to submit any further questions in the chat facility, and we will collate them and we will send you an FAQ. You might even come up with other questions throughout the course of the webinar. So the webinar is going to last about an hour, hopefully less than that. I know everybody's interested in that at the start of the meeting, and the recording will be made available afterwards to attendees, and we'll have it available on our website as well. And just an important point for anybody who's watching it at a later date, based on the information that's available today, the 3rd of December 2020, in relation to governance advice and Department of Education circulars, it is up to date. But again, this may be subject to change if any of these circulars are superseded. So that's the introduction. And I suppose just before we look at the particular questions that you have posed for us, we're going to take a few slides just to put the content of the presentation into its legislative context. So the keeping of accounts and records in schools must be in accordance with Section 18 of the Education Act. And you have Section 18 there in front of you. I'm just going to read it out. A board shall keep all proper and usual accounts and records of all monies received by it, or expenditure of such monies incurred by it, and shall ensure that in each year all such accounts are properly audited or certified in accordance with best accounting practice. So that's the legislative basis for the keeping of Board of Management accounts. So a Board of Management is accountable to the patron, and for our members, the patron is your bishop. So in relation to the management of school accounts, you're accountable to the patron for that. And the patron is entitled to request a copy of the accounts. And it's important that all schools should, just make sure that they fulfill any specific requirements of their individual patron in relation to the keeping of accounts or the submission of annual accounts. So many of the questions that we would have got in the past in relation to this particular section of the Education Act was around whether schools should be certified, school accounts should be certified, or whether they should be audited. And we were asked that quite a lot. And this question has become somewhat redundant since February 2020, when schools were required to submit their annual school accounts for the 2018-2019 school year to the FSSU. So that was the first time that the accounts were to be submitted to the FSSU. So the format of that submission, and I'm sure that the majority of you have submitted all of those, because I know it was very, very high, the submission rate. So that particular format is what's known as a compilation of accounts. So it's agreed between the Department of Education and the FSSU, and it fulfills the obligations of a board under Section 18. So they'll be referred to as the compiled accounts. So other queries that we've received in relation to accounts, just from the registration: can they be compiled every second year? We're a small school, there isn't as much money going through our accounts, and it is very expensive to have the accounts audited or certified or compiled or whatever. And the answer is no, they must be done every year. That's quite clear, and even more so now, obviously, because they have to be submitted to the FSSU every year. And another one, obviously, that comes up quite a bit is in relation to the school accounts year. Is it the calendar year? And no, it's not. It runs for the school year. So it's from the beginning of September to the end of August of the following year. So another section of the Education Act, which is particularly relevant to what we're going to talk about this evening, is Section 15. Again, I'm going to read it out for you. It says that boards are required to have regard to the efficient use of resources, and in particular, to the efficient use of state funds. So that's in Section 15 of the Education Act. So that really says that boards have a statutory duty to ensure that appropriate systems and procedures are in place to ensure that the school's financial resources, including grants, are managed appropriately and efficiently. So all grants should be used for the purposes for which they're intended. And I know that Paul and Joe are going to go through that in greater detail at a later stage. And if you managed to check your email before you joined the webinar, you will have seen that I sent out a list of grants that are to be paid to primary schools for the 2020-2021 school year. So we sent it out in advance to make better use of our time tonight. And if you didn't get it, we will have it available on the CPSMA website. So the governance manual for primary schools, you're all very familiar with it as board members. It's the official resource of board members. It's not a guidance note. This document has a statutory basis, and it's important that every member of the board has a copy of it, and that they take time to become familiar with the contents of all of that document. Now, the two chapters that relate particularly to what we're going to be looking at tonight is obviously Chapter 12, which deals with the role of the treasurer. And I know a number of questions have come in. Where can we get information about the exact duties of the treasurer? Well, hopefully you'll have them after tonight, but you'll see that that's covered in Chapter 12. I won't be going into it in any great detail, but it's a reference for you. And the other one is Chapter 17 of the governance manual, where it sets out the board's duties in relation to finance. So as I say, I'm not going to go through them, but we are going to reference them at various points during each of the presentations. So again, another piece of legislation under the Charities Act of 2009, there is a requirement for each board of management to have its school registered with the charities regulator and to verify that information once a year. So if there have been any changes, we'll say, in the members of the board, the personnel on the board, then that should be notified to the charities regulator. It has to be updated once a year. So as part of that registration process, Board of Management members as charity trustees, because you are charity trustees as well as board members. You're required to provide your name and the start date on the board and your residential address. Now, obviously, residential addresses won't be included on the public part, but you are required to submit all of that information to the charities regulator. And just going back to our go-to document, the governance manual, the charities regulator has advised the Department of Education that boards of management who comply fully with the governance manual for primary schools will also meet their requirements as set out by the regulator in the Charities Governance Code. So once you follow the provisions of the governance manual, you're fulfilling your obligations in terms of governance as a charity. So this means the boards won't have to send in their annual accounts to the charities regulator. So by submitting them to the FSSU on an annual basis, you're fulfilling that element of it as well. So, and you're satisfying that legal requirement. Okay, so the next two slides, we're going to be looking at the duties of the treasurer. Now, I'm referring to them as the duties of the treasurer, the tasks that one particular officer of the Board of Management has, rather than the corporate responsibility of the board in terms of a school finance, because obviously that is a corporate responsibility. So we're just going to look at the duties of the treasurer. So obviously to keep the school accounts, to prepare budgets, and all of this, I think at this stage of the year will have been done, but if it's not too late to start doing it. And Joe is going to be talking to you a little bit about that. Making lodgements now, a lot of our treasurers would say, look, it's easier for the school secretary to make lodgements, and that would probably normally be the case, and that's fine, as long as there's an agreed protocol between the treasurer and the school secretary in relation to the sort of detail that's retained when the lodgement is made, and it should be handed over straight away. You know, you need to have that conversation. You need to make sure that the detail that you require for the various categories of the accounts, that's covered in the lodgement, so that you can do your work properly. Arrange for payments of bills, etc. Arrange for petty cash. If the school operates one, you don't have to, but there is provision there in the governance manual for that. And to deal with payrolls, and that will include the payment of the PAYE, PRSI, though all of those deductions, the statutory deductions to be made, universal social charge, PRSAs, like there is provision there for PRSAs, which are the personal retirement savings accounts, which may be put in place for employees that are paid directly by the Board of Management. Now, as you know, all our teachers and SNAs and some caretakers and secretaries are paid directly by the department, but all of the other employees are paid by the Board of Management, again, with the assistance of grants that are, you know, dedicated for those payments. So boards don't have to contribute anything to a personal retirement savings account, but the board must facilitate setting up one of those accounts if the employee wants it. So you facilitate the setup of it, you don't pay anything into it. But again, that would all be part of the role of the treasurer to make sure that all of those are in place. Now, again, just to mention that the FSSU has prepared monthly reporting templates to assist the treasurer in keeping monthly reports of the accounts for presentation at board meetings, and also as I said, the budget templates, and Joe is going to go through those in the course of his presentation. So some further duties of the treasurer: to comply with revenue requirements, including RCT and VAT, and this refers to the payment of relevant contract tax and reverse charge VAT in relation to construction work. And this is a statutory requirement under the Taxes Consolidation Act of 1997. So anytime there's any construction to be done, they're conducted by the school, where the school is the principal contractor, then the treasurer will have to make sure that the appropriate RCT and VAT is paid. And the construction you're talking about, it's construction, it's the demolition, extension, any alteration of a school building. And if you need any clarification on that, you can contact your local revenue office and they'll give you advice on whether it's subject to RCT and to VAT. And I just want to refer you to a very helpful revenue publication which explains the board's obligations in this regard. It's called A Guidance Note for Boards of Management for Relevant Contract Tax and Value Added Tax, and it's updated on a regular basis. The most recent update is May 2019. So that's a guidance note for boards of management for RCT and VAT, and it's a very good document. Again, moving on, comply with procurement procedures when awarding contracts. One of the queries that came in was in relation to some work that was being done to resurface one of the schoolyards, and the query was, do we need to get a number of different quotations for that? And really, to get advice on anything to do with that sort of procurement, and you'd be engaging with procurement for the ICT grant, and again for the PPE grant, that one of the COVID grants. So any query at all that you have as a treasurer in relation to procurement, you should contact well, first of all, you can have a look at section 27 of the governance manual, and that sets out the procedures for the procurement of goods and services. But the school's procurement unit, the SPU, another acronym in education. So the school's procurement unit is the central support resource for providing guidance to all primary schools on any issue around procurement. So if you have a query in relation to that, you should contact the school's procurement unit and they'll be more than happy to help you. So again, the duties of the treasurer to keep vouchers of payment for inspection. It mightn't be a bad time to mention at this point that the retention of accounts, the retention period is 6 years, so all school accounts should be retained for 6 years. Present an up-to-date statement of account at each board meeting, and arrange for the payment of insurance. And for Catholic schools, the insurers are Allianz, so it's the Allianz custodian policy that's required for all schools under Catholic patronage. So again, there are 2 slides that they're just a very short list of the duties, or you might consider them a long list of the duties of the treasurer, but they are set out in the governance manual as well. So we've referenced the statutory requirements to keep proper and usual accounts, under the Education Act, but from an operational point of view, proper accounts and records are kept to provide accurate information to inform the board's decision making and their future expenditure. So just to make sure that the board has the accurate information available to them. So this will inform the decision making, that it is based on accurate and up-to-date information, and to make sure that the board can fulfill its statutory responsibilities. So that's from an operational point of view, that's where it's important that the accounts and records are kept up to date. Okay, another question that we've been asked about is around signatories on school accounts. So I'm just actually going to read the section from the governance manual just to be clear on it. So the governance manual says the cheque and online payments must be authorised by 2 of 3 nominated signatories of the board, one being the chairperson and the other the treasurer in the first instance. So they're the 2 main signatories. And it says as well that the chairperson may nominate a 3rd signatory to sign on the accounts when the chairperson isn't available. So the first 2, in the first instance, the treasurer and the chairperson, and when the chairperson isn't available, the 3rd signatory can step in. So what the governance manual does recommend in terms of the 3rd signatory, that the 3rd signatory would come from one of the other constituent groups in the board. So let's say your treasurer is a parent nominee, then it would be recommended that perhaps the 3rd signatory would come from one of the other groups, like the community nominee. We're also asked from time to time, can a principal be a signatory on the board accounts? There's nothing precluding a principal being a signatory. So the principal can, A lot of principals don't want that responsibility, would prefer to have nothing to do with it. And some principals are quite happy to be the signatories, maybe from the point of view of convenience. But the answer to the question is that the principal can, that they're not precluded from being the signatory on the board. And actually, maybe just before I move on to the introduction of the FSSU, in relation to signatory on board accounts, and I suppose this really relates to online banking, because very often it's the school secretary who would upload the transactions onto, for the online banking, and then they have to be authorized after that. You will still require 2 out of the 3 authorized signatories on an online transaction, because the secretary, first of all, isn't a member of the board, and the secretary isn't an authorized signatory. So that is not considered one of the authorized signatories. The 2 signatories must come after that. So I've mentioned the Financial Support Services Unit a couple of times at this point, the FSSU. And the FSSU was established by the Department of Education and Skills and operates to support boards of management in fulfilling their statutory obligations under Section 18 of the Act. So they are a support mechanism for school management in terms of compliance. And I'm now delighted to welcome Joe Conlon. Joe is a primary school coordinator with FSSU. And Joe's going to address some of the queries that you've raised, as well as looking at some of the queries that are regularly received in the FSSU office. So you're very welcome, Joe. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you, Noreen, for the opportunity to join the panel this evening. Regarding COVID-19, there have been a large number of grants paid over to boards since the pandemic started, and we have issued a number of guidelines on these. And these guidelines, they're our interpretation of the circulars. Circulars can be complex documents, and it's our role to break them down and extract what is relevant to the primary schools sector and insert this information into our guidelines. And I suppose the task has never been more relevant than in the last number of months, with the various changes that have taken place and the levels of funding and the different types of funding that have been made available. So a large amount of queries we dealt with at the time related to the payment of ancillary staff over the period that the schools were closed. And our instructions were simple in that they were to pay these staff as normal, as the ancillary grants had been paid to individual schools. The simplest way to look at it was to look at what were the conditions of employment for 2019 around areas like holiday pay and payment over the midterm breaks, and adhere to these for 2020. Of course, there were particular cases where outliers arose, but it was part of our role to deal with the queries when they were received over this period. On the FSSU website, we have a calculator created whereby you can calculate the amount that would have been received over to your individual school. So just next slide, please. Thank you. So I've been asked to discuss some of the areas that we receive a large volume of queries on, and right at the top of this list are payments to ancillary staff. The pay rises for our ancillary staff, they're basically the unwinding of FEMPI, which is the Financial Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Act, over the last number of years. So cleaners and bus escorts have received approximately an increase of 10% over a period of 5 years, up until October of this year, October 2020. Whereas hourly paid secretaries, caretakers, they received this 10% increase over a shorter period, over 4 years. So that is why their payment increases went to the 10% up until January 2019. So there hasn't been an increase since for that body. Just to note that even if people are not on the minimum wages, which you can see there on the screen, they are entitled to the mandatory pay rise. This is part of the FEMPI regulations. So if a board goes ahead and gives a pay rise outside the mandatory pay rise, the FEMPI scheduled pay increase is still applicable. unless within the terms of the non-mandatory pay rise, it is stipulated that it will cover the next FEMPI scheduled pay increase. I suppose just to go over that again, if the board decided to give a cleaner a pay rise of 5% in August 2020, the cleaner under FEMPI regulations would still be entitled to the 2% in October 2020 increase, unless it was documented that the August pay rise encompassed the October mandatory increase. Okay. But what I've kind of discussed there, change is on the way. It's been in the news recently. Secretaries, caretakers are to have their conditions of employment regularized under a preliminary agreement reached at the Workplace Relations Commission. So what the term regularized means will come out, I suppose, over the next few months. It's a case of watching this space. But the provisional implementation date is September 2021. So, you're looking at a very, very quick turnaround from that perspective. Okay. Go to the next slide, please. Some schools still use cheques as the preferred method for settling all payments, and I know that it was touched on there by Noreen, but the use of cheques have become more expensive and time consuming. And among many things that we've seen over the last 6 months were the challenges getting access to approved payments due to having lack of access to each other at board level. So some boards had serious difficulty getting access to various members of the board in order to get cheques signed to pay staff or suppliers. However, through online banking, a lot of people were able to approve payments independently of each other. Now, and again, regarding electronic banking, the charges associated are considerably cheaper than cheques, and we would encourage all schools to move in this direction as soon as is possible for them. And the National Payments Plan under public sector bodies are encouraged to move towards it. There are workings, there are difficulties in getting set up, but once you're set up and operating, it can be seamless for schools. But there are difficulties, obviously, dealing with the individual banks in your individual regions. And but once setup is complete, it does make life so much easier for people within the school environment. Approval must first be obtained from the Board of Management for the use of electronic banking. And I see it, electronic payments are subject to the same rules as a cheque payment, and therefore must be approved by the two nominated signatories of the board, as Noreen has discussed. Any additions and amendments to payees must be approved by the authorised signatories, must be approved by the board. And I suppose the onus is on the board to ensure that the bank is aware of these controls. So a lot of the time we see with banks that they're set up under current accounts, under personal banking. So this means that it would only take one person to approve a transaction. But going back to what I've stated regarding cheque payments, that there needs to be two people, two authorisers. And business banking, for what all these banks have, is the way to go. A bank may not know in your region or your local town. They might know that they have to set up on a business banking perspective, but we've dealt with them and we've corresponded with them and told them, but it can vary. Some banks have a more centralised structure where you deal with them on a central basis and they're aware. But if you're in a regional basis, it can vary. So it's important to understand that it's really the digital banking services you need to go down through. I could go down through the individual banks, but I don't think it merits it. What you can do is just, again, everything is like, just call us if you have a query or look at the guidelines that we have. We've it broken down between the individual banks and the contacts that you can make within the numbers we have between all the pillar banks, let's say AAB, Bank of Ireland, Permanent TSB and Ulster Bank. I'm also going to just spend a little bit of time discussing the common questions that we receive, and some of the points that might be more pertinent to you this evening. One of the queries was regarding the financial internal control reviews that the FSSU carry out. So this goes back to our role as set out by the department as per Circular 60/2017. At the request of the department, the FSSU can carry out audits or financial internal control reviews of schools. Also, patrons have contacted the FSSU under the circular. They're entitled to request that an audit or a financial internal control review of a school under their remit be carried out also. So the way it works is that the FSSU will receive a very specific terms of reference from the department, and we adhere to that, to the letter. So what a financial internal control review is, it's a walkthrough of the financial systems and controls within a school. So we will typically meet with a principal, a chairperson and a treasurer and review the current financial practices. So based on this review, we'll sit down and we'll go through the different internal controls from a finance perspective within the school, and we'll issue recommendings based on our findings. And those recommendations are, I suppose, what we've documented or we've learned over the years. And the key is to get to a point where there's consistency across the primary school sector regarding how certain controls are in around all the key areas. And something like banking online would be one of them. We'd encourage people to get onto it, whereby the advantages are for something like banking online. There's an audit trail there. It's very, very easy to filter and look at the information. So that would be just a typical recommendation that we'd recommend that the school would adopt banking online. So, as I said, we are requested to by the department or the patron, and we have a very, very specific terms of reference from the department, and we'll carry out that as requested. Another issue we've queries regarding the submission process, and regarding the submission of accounts with the February 2020 deadline, there was a very high level of compliance, and it's a credit to everyone in the school environment for the success of the submission process. It really, from our point of view, there was huge buy-in from all the key stakeholders in the process. We're very appreciative of that. Just some of the items noted from the 2018-2019 submission process. Accounts do need to be prepared by someone external to the board. There's the element of the Education Act, Section 18, where it relates the external element. So it can't be a board member that prepares the accounts. Obviously, the board chairperson and another member of the board would be signing the accounts. Another issue was that the accountants must be a member of a prescribed accountancy body. So this is something we've been in constant contact with accountants and the different bodies over the last number of years. So last week, for instance, over 2 days, we hosted over 600 accountants at online webinars explaining the process for the 2019-2020 submission of accounts. We've developed a number of improvements to the submission process, which we've outlined to the accountants, and we feel that this will reduce the amount of time it takes to submit accounts. There's an automatic upload of the trial balance this year, so that will save time. And if you think even for 25-30 minutes would be saved for each school, you're looking at for over 3,000 schools. Well, with the FSSU unit comprising primary, post-primary and CNC for the first time this year, CNC, you're looking at thousands of hours being saved regarding the upload process. Some other issues that we would have seen or queries coming in would be about the Parents Association. I know Paul is going to touch on that. Would be the Parents Association accounts needing to be reflected in the overall annual accounts, and also that we needed the registered charity number to be stated on the submission. We reached agreement with the charities regulator that only schools that had registered with them could submit to the FSSU, and by submitting to the FSSU, that satisfied the requirements of the charities regulator and the CSO and the FSSU. So it was 3 birds with the one stone. Now, we have been asked regarding the 28th of February 2021. There is no extension even regarding COVID. There hasn't been agreement on pushing out the 28th of February deadline. From our perspective, there was very little economic transactions for many months towards the end of the school year. So we feel that it'd be possible to manage from getting that information across from September. So as of now, the deadline is the 28th of February 2021 is in place. Now, I suppose this isn't a format to go deep into the FSSU monthly reporting templates or the budget templates, but just I suppose state that we are there to help, and that if you were to call us, one of the account techs in my office, could be Yvonne, or it could be Anne, or it could be Rosie in the Cork office, or Leash, or one of our team members, will be able to give support around a secretary maybe have difficulty getting up and running with the monthly reporting template. So we have situations whereby one of our account techs may spend an hour and a half to 2 hours getting someone up and running on the templates, and that same conversation with the secretary, it could only be a half an hour over the next period. So we have the support there. I think it's key to give the remote support so we can actually log into someone's computer. It doesn't matter if they're in East Cork or West Donegal. We can give that support. Look, we try to make the templates as straightforward as possible. There are a lot of codes on our system that may not apply to your individual school, but these codes, we can remove these at the start of the year on our system, so you won't have to be looking at them if they don't apply to your school. So there's also a drill down function whereby you can filter for a specific term, for example ESB, and you'll be able to get a list of all ESB charges for the period. So again, as I said, it's fully supported at no cost by our team of accounting technicians, and we can take a range of queries across, I suppose a lot of different, not just the templates, but I must state again that our templates are in line with what the accountant will have to submit at the year end, and it does provide what you're going to need at a board of management meeting as your income and expenditure reports and your bank reconciliations and your consolidated income and expenditure accounts if you have more than one bank account. So, but having said that, our monthly templates, they aren't mandatory. So the use of FSSU internal templates is optional for schools who may, if they so wish, continue to use what they currently are. So what is mandatory is the submission process that the accountants will have to do on an annual basis, and the accounts that they will submit are in line with our templates, with our codes. So obviously, from that point of view, there's less work on the accountants at that time of the year, as they'll be transferring similar data across if they're using our templates. Now, the last point I'm going to touch on is regarding the use of the FSSU budget template. Definitely, the real value in carrying out a budget is your early August, when you've got a good knowledge of how many students are starting at that time. So obviously it's very much linked to your ancillary and your capitation. They're linked to the number of students in the school. So the school budget will assist the principal in effective decision making to manage the school finances on a day-to-day basis. And a budget, it'll assist with controlling the school's financial resources and maximising the use of available resources. And again, as I stated, we have instruction videos there, as we do with the templates, as with the budgets, and we can get people up and running via just looking at your accounts from the previous year and sitting down via the remote support and going through what you would expect movement for your expenses, your income over the year. So it's a very valuable exercise to be referring back to the budget as the year progresses. And the school, along with as stated in the governance manual, it is mandatory, and the school should formally approve the budget each year, and the approval should be noted in the minutes of the meeting. So those are some of the areas that I was just going to cover. So I'll pass you over to Paul now, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Joe. So there are, I suppose, a few slides left. We're not going to keep you too long, and I know this is quite heavy with regard to finance. I just want to very quickly start by just appreciating the voluntary work that all treasurers do for boards of management, and along with other board members in over 2,800 schools. The primary education couldn't function without you. So just it's deeply appreciated, and you play a very valuable role. In terms of the general grant system, just a couple of comments before going into each specific grant. The CPSMA is acutely aware of the general level of grant funding and provision to run schools and how tight that is, and I'll allude to that later with regard to fundraising. And an increase in capitation and the ancillary grant has been the #1 issue for CPSMA in advance of successive budgets, leading to an increase in those areas. Similarly as well, in advance of the return to school, CPSMA was very much in talks with the department, was very clear that schools and confident that schools could return safely in September, but that the proper resources and finance had to be in place to do so. Unfortunately, we feel that that has been the case in the first term, and those discussions are ongoing for the next number of terms as well. So not all of these grants, and I'm really conscious of treasurers who are in the role for the first time, and all of this information is new to you. So not all of these grants, not all schools receive all the same grants, and also they come from different sections of the department. So it can be a little bit confusing. And Noreen has put together what I think is a really comprehensive fact sheet for you on the grants when they generally occur, and also the circular underpinning them, and how they're calculated. So in general terms, you'll see there at the top, the capitation grant really is the main cash cow, so to speak, for how the school works every year. And it's based on the number of pupils in the school on the previous year, 30th of September on the previous year. And that's awarded then in 2 tranches during the year, one in January and the other one in June, 70% in January, which is always very eagerly anticipated. The second grant then is the ancillary services grant, and it covers secretarial and caretaking assistance in the school. Now, while capitation covers, say, heat, light, insurance, ancillary grant is for those additional, that assistance to pay those wages. For those who are in what they call the devolved grant scheme, and not the 1978-79 scheme, those employees are paid directly by the Department of Education. But the vast majority of schools would be on the devolved scheme. And also just on that, for the cost of cleaning in a school, staff for cleaning, it is possible, there is flexibility there to use the capitation grant and the ancillary grant for that purpose to make sure that cleaning staff are paid. Then the next one, then the book grant scheme. So each year that an annual amount is provided to school per pupil, again, towards the operation of a book rental scheme. And standardized testing, again, is another annual grant that's paid in April each year to cover resources and materials relating to standardized testing every year. It wasn't paid last year due to the pandemic and the fact that testing didn't take place. The minor works grant, so again, it issues to all schools for minor physical infrastructure work or furniture or equipment that needs to be purchased by the school. It's actually due now in December 2020, but that's the grant from next November 2021 that's being brought back and being paid out in advance. So boards should just be conscious that it's not necessarily the case that another grant will also issue next November. So prudent budgeting will be required there, but it is good to have it in advance. The ICT grant is not an annual grant, but it's been paid over a 5-year period as a result of the department's digital strategy. And again, it's due this year in early December 2020. And also in ICT, schools can qualify for assistive technology. Specific applications can be made for individual pupils with specific educational needs. And that would be the special education section. And then finally, you'll see the last three. So capital grants would be awarded for building projects, extensions, new builds, emergency works, and that would be the school building and planning section in Tullamore that deal with those grants and amounts of money. The disadvantage schemes, again, only apply to certain schools. If a school is in a school meals scheme, if a school is designated as JESH, which is a designated disadvantage, again, they would be other grants that would be awarded from the social inclusion unit. And finally then, again, if schools have pupils attending, getting specific transport, there would be grants available for that, and also escorts, bus escorts who would accompany them to school. So that's, I suppose, a rough race through the general grant scheme. The other common question we get here in this area is, what if we don't spend all of our grant money in a single year? So as Joe was saying there, schools should have a budget for the year. You should look at the start of the school year, the money that you have for annual expenses, a projection of it, and also one-off individual occurrences, such as maybe a building project, and plan accordingly. And each of the grants that you get should be entered in each section, and the FSSU template has each section already pre-populated or pre-headed for you. So regardless of the time it takes to spend the grant, what is important is that it's used for that purpose for which it was intended, and it's clearly stated in the template accounts for that year, or if it needs to for successive years. Okay, so next of all, again, another common, in line with what Joe said about online banking, school credit cards are now becoming very popular, especially for transactions online that can't be paid for with, for example, checks. So the important thing with regard to credit cards is that there are proper procedures and protocols in place for their use. So in terms of the application process, before a school applies for a credit card, the protocols and procedures should be agreed at board level and minuted at board level, and an application made to the patron, which would be the diocese, for permission to get a credit card. And then an application is made for the bank. A credit card can only be used by the principal. It should only be the only person awarded to use it, and is responsible for it at all times, including its safe custody and security. In terms of limits and authorization, so the board should agree the credit limit that's going to be in place, and it should only be used for bona fide school expenses where expenditure can't be met for, by example, through checks. And it should never be used to withdraw cash or for personal use under any circumstances. And credit cards should have 2 approvers, as in the case if it was a check, for example, or electronic payments. Then in terms of account reconciliation, so once the monthly credit card statement is received, all original invoices or receipts should be checked off against everything that's on the statement and stapled to it. And then in terms of approval, the principal and the chairperson should just satisfy themselves that everything is in order, and they would both sign the monthly credit card before payment is issued. And finally then, a question in this area: what about, as we say in Donegal, a credit card or a debit card would be while handy. It's very easier to use than a credit card. And it's actually part for its ease of use that the governance manual clearly states that debit cards should not be used by primary schools. and it's mainly for governance reasons. So the credit card provides more protection in terms of account governance. So the money is not debited automatically with a credit card, and also it's easier to reconcile, as I stated, whereas a debit card takes the money out immediately, and debit card transactions will only appear in the general statement, so it can be very difficult to trawl through it to reconcile. And you'll see there a note, the financial guideline from the FSSU has information there on the use of school credit cards. So finally then from me is fundraising. And CPSMA commissioned a report in 2018 published by Grant Thornton, which estimated that schools that fundraising was contributing €46 million a year towards the running of Catholic primary schools in the Republic of Ireland. And that's a staggering amount of money. And it highlights how much work is put in by schools, supplementing, as we mentioned previously, the grants that they receive. And the work that's done is massive from parents, from the local community, from the board in this regard. And when it goes well, it is brilliant. But again, I suppose this is an ideal opportunity now before the next school year, because there won't have been a lot of fundraising taking place this year, unfortunately, to have a look at what I'm saying would be best practice with regard to fundraising. And the most common issue that arises is that a lot of people have ownership of schools or feel they have a sense of ownership of schools, and that would be board members, staff, parents, local community. And sometimes a scenario happens where somebody thinks of a great idea, or they hear about maybe Strictly or Who Wants to Be a Gazillionaire. And as a result of that, before anybody knows anything, this person or group of people have run with this idea. There's sponsorship going out everywhere. There's a hotel booked, and they kind of have ownership of this project. And the difficulty is with regard to all the questions that haven't been answered in advance. So the ideal practice, and again, the most common group that fundraise on behalf of schools is the Parents Association, who do a fantastic job. And what I would say is best practice at the start of every year, that any application for fundraising must have prior Board of Management consent. So instead of doing this on an individual basis, that the board, if they're considering fundraising, or the Parents Association, or a combination of the two, would submit a list of their fundraising applications, the proposed fundraisers that they're going to have during the year. And beside each of these fundraisers should state what type of event it's going to be, when it's going to take place, the purpose of it, and how long it will take from start to finish, the target of fundraising to be raised, and then finally, and very importantly, the timeline for transfer of the funds to the Board of Management. When that's all done in advance, everybody is clear on the boundaries, on the purpose and the responsibilities. And when it finishes, then the expenditure is by the Board of Management. So it's really important from that point of view that everyone is aware of that, because sometimes there can be difficulties in that regard. Now, it's important, I would say, that there is ownership of the other group, and in most cases the Parents Association, in what the funding is being raised for. It makes it easier to fundraise, it generates more enthusiasm. So it's a shared responsibility, and not simply a case of the board saying, well, thanks a million for all that work, but we'll take charge of it now. But if, for example, there is work going on, a building going on to the school, and fundraising is going towards it, then there are, I suppose, expenses that have to be paid, like RCT that was raised earlier, that can only be done by the Board of Management. Okay. Now, so a question then is, let's say you have a fundraiser, and there's a farmer beside the school has an acre, and he says, listen, you have 6 weeks to make up your mind. Do you want this for X amount of money? What I've outlined there doesn't mean that you can't go and make an exceptional case at a board meeting for an individual fundraiser for an individual purpose. But at the same time, the structure is in place, and that would have to be done on an exceptional basis. Now, the Parent Association is entitled to raise funds for its own administration and to have an account in its own name. And I would suggest that at the end of each year, that an amount is discussed and agreed for the PA to retain in its account as a float, so to speak, from year to year. And the other thing, as Joe also mentioned, is the PA's account has to be included in the school's annual accounts as well. And the governance manual, the references there to it, that this, again, as Noreen said, the governance manual underpins the work of the school, and this is stated in it. So the one other thing then, a common question which we've received in is, let's say, what happens if we raise all this money and it's not all needed? So in that regard, the funds have to be raised for the purpose for which they're being raised. If it's unnecessary that it's all required, then the board should communicate that with the parent association and the wider community if necessary, and then agree with the PA what the funding will be used for instead. But it has to be used by the school because it was raised on behalf of the school. Okay, so that's all from me, and just thank you very much again, and I'll pass you back now on to Noreen.
Just two questions, I suppose, that came into my head as Paul was making his presentation there in relation to the fundraising. It was one that came in at the last minute, and I'm only bringing it up because fundraising was the last issue addressed, and it was around voluntary contributions. Somebody sent in that query today. The query was, can we still ask for voluntary contributions? And the answer is yes, you can. They haven't been outlawed, but they have to be voluntary. You know, you can't expect people, you can certainly request it. We've been asked, can you give us an example of how much to ask for? We won't be saying that either. You know, that's up to every board to decide. And again, to remember that it is voluntary, and just be careful about the time of year that you would ask for a voluntary contribution, lest it be considered as part of an enrolment process, which, you know, that can't happen. So just that was an answer to that particular question. And in relation to the example that Paul gave about the use of the funds, that's great. Thanks for that, Leo. In relation to the use of the funds, and if a farmer offers you the sale of a field, the first person you talk to is the patron's office, because as anything in relation to that, you'll be contacting the patron, and then you'll be following all the other financial pieces if that's going to be allowed. So I'm just going to take this final opportunity to thank you for joining us on yet another webinar. You've been very supportive of the webinars that we've broadcasted, and I know that you've attended many more of them, and you've had some this week already. So we really do appreciate the time that you give to upskill yourselves as members of the board and to do the best for your schools, and we really appreciate that, and thank you for joining us. We hope that you found the content beneficial, and I suppose more importantly, we hope that you found it relevant, because that really was the purpose of it. Now, some of the questions that we received in the course of registration were very school specific, and we wouldn't address them in an open forum like that. But what we would say to you is, please contact the office and we'll give you specific advice in response to specific questions. And if you have any question at all in relation to the content of the webinar, again, if you contact our office, our CPSMA education advisors are available from 9 until 5 to speak with school principals and chairpersons in relation to not just finance, but a lot of the other management and governance issues. So I'd like to extend my thanks to my co-presenters, Paul and Joe. And in turn, we'd like to thank Leo Colgan from IMS Integrated Media for keeping us on the straight and narrow. Thanks for that, Leo. And for helping us to deliver the webinar. And as Leo mentioned earlier on, there is just a brief evaluation that we really would appreciate if you fill it in, because we'll learn from your responses, and we'll continue to strive to give you the best experience in online training. So keep safe, everyone. Thanks again for joining us, and Slán Tamil.